The neighborhood looked like something pulled from a brochure: perfect lines, identical rooftops, carefully measured distances between homes, and a silence that felt almost engineered. Everything about it suggested order. Not the natural kind, but the kind that had been decided, enforced, and maintained with precision. For most people, that kind of place felt safe. For others, it felt controlled. When the narrator first arrived, the appeal was obvious. After years of instability and constant movement, the idea of living somewhere predictable felt like a reward. There was comfort in knowing what to expect. Clean streets, organized surroundings, and a system designed to keep everything in place. The homeowners association was introduced early. Documents were provided, guidelines explained, and expectations set in a tone that balanced friendliness with authority. Everything appeared reasonable. The rules weren't extreme. They were presented as a way to protect property values and maintain a consistent environment. At first, it all made sense. The narrator settled in quickly. His house, while aligned with the neighborhood's overall design, carried small differences, subtle choices that reflected personal taste rather than strict conformity. The yard was arranged with a bit more openness. Decorative elements were placed with intention, but not rigid symmetry. Nothing violated the rules. But it stood out just enough to be noticed. The first few weeks passed without issue. No interruptions. No notices. The system felt distant, almost invisible. It existed, but it didn't interfere. That changed quietly. It began with a presence. A woman across the street, standing still a little longer than necessary, her attention focused not generally on the street, but specifically on one property. His property. The kind of observation that could easily be dismissed, if it didn't happen again. And again. At first, it felt like coincidence. People look around. They notice things. That was normal. But there was something about the consistency of her attention that felt intentional. She didn't approach. She didn't speak. She simply observed. Days later, the first notice appeared. It was attached neatly to the front door. Formal. Structured. It referenced a minor issue, something so small it barely registered as a problem. A slight misalignment of a decorative fixture. A suggestion framed as a requirement. The narrator corrected it immediately. There was no reason not to. It was simple. Quick. Done. For a moment, it felt like the system was working exactly as intended. Until the second notice arrived. This time, the issue was different. Another small detail. Another correction. Still within reason, but the timing felt faster. Closer. Almost as if the resolution of one issue triggered the discovery of another. Again, he fixed it. Still no frustration. Just compliance. But the pattern continued. Each time an adjustment was made, another issue surfaced. None of them were significant on their own. But together, they created a cycle that didn't seem to end. The house began to feel less like a personal space and more like a project under review. And the woman across the street remained constant. Her presence became tied to the timing of these notices. Not directly, not obviously, but consistently enough to form a connection. It didn't take long for the narrator to learn who she was. She was part of the HOA. Not just a member, but someone with influence. The kind that didn't need to be announced. The kind that operated quietly, through observation and reporting rather than direct confrontation. She never approached him. She didn't need to. The system spoke for her. The notices, the inspections, the corrections, they all carried the same tone. Formal. Neutral. Procedural. But the focus was always the same. His property. At first, he questioned himself. Maybe he had overlooked something. Maybe his interpretation of the rules wasn't as precise as it should be. That was a reasonable assumption. So he became more careful. He reviewed guidelines more closely. Double-checked every detail. Made adjustments before they could be questioned. But it didn't change anything. The notices kept coming. And that's when the realization began to form. This wasn't about fixing issues. It was about maintaining control. The system wasn't reacting to problems, it was creating a continuous cycle of correction. And that cycle had a target. Him. The emotional impact didn't arrive all at once. It built gradually. A subtle tension that settled into daily routines. Every decision about the property carried weight. Every change felt like it would be evaluated before it even existed. The house no longer felt like his. It felt monitored. He began noticing something else. Other houses in the neighborhood had similar, sometimes even more obvious inconsistencies. Small deviations. Minor imperfections. The kind that would easily fall under the same rules he was being held to. But they remained untouched. No notices. No corrections. No pressure. That was the moment everything shifted. Because inconsistency reveals intention. And once intention becomes visible, it changes how everything is understood. The narrator stopped reacting automatically. Instead, he started observing. Quietly. Carefully. He began documenting everything. Notices. Dates. Details. What was requested. How quickly it was followed by something new. He tracked patterns, even when they seemed small. Because patterns don't stay small. They grow. They connect. They reveal. At the same time, he paid attention to the woman. Not in an obvious way, but enough to notice her routine. Her presence wasn't random. It followed a rhythm. Appearances that aligned too closely with enforcement to be coincidence. She wasn't just observing. She was directing attention. And the system responded. The neighborhood itself remained quiet. Too quiet. Conversations stayed surface level. Neighbors avoided HOA-related topics, shifting discussions quickly whenever they came close. There was an unspoken understanding. People knew. But they didn't engage. That silence created isolation. And isolation made the pressure feel more personal than it actually was. But the narrator was no longer isolated in his thinking. He had something more powerful than reaction. He had awareness. And awareness changes everything. Because once you start seeing how a system works, you stop being controlled by how it appears. And that's when the balance begins to shift. What the HOA Karen didn't realize was that she hadn't just targeted a house. She had triggered something much bigger. Something patient. Something observant. Something that was about to turn the entire system back on itself. What had begun as a sequence of small, almost dismissible notices slowly transformed into something far more complex. The narrator no longer saw each violation as an isolated inconvenience. Instead, they formed a pattern, one that extended beyond his property and into the deeper structure of the neighborhood itself. Daily life began to change in subtle but persistent ways. Simple routines no longer felt simple. Walking outside to adjust a small detail in the yard carried a quiet sense of anticipation. Any visible change, no matter how minor, felt like it might trigger another inspection. The house, which had once represented stability, now felt like a space under evaluation. This constant awareness created pressure, but not the kind that could be easily confronted. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was quiet and consistent, shaping behavior over time. The narrator responded the only way he could, by becoming more precise. He revisited every HOA guideline, every document that had been provided at the time of purchase. He read them carefully, looking not just for rules, but for interpretation. What exactly qualified as a violation? How much variation was allowed? Where did the language leave room for subjectivity? The more he studied, the more he realized that many of the rules were not absolute. They were flexible. Terms like appropriate, consistent, and in harmony with the neighborhood appeared repeatedly. These words created a framework that sounded structured but allowed for interpretation. And interpretation, in the wrong hands, could become control. At the same time, he began to expand his observation beyond his own property. The neighborhood, once seen as a uniform environment, revealed subtle differences when viewed closely. Small inconsistencies appeared everywhere, variations in landscaping, differences in exterior design, minor deviations that technically fell under the same rules he was being held to. But those homes remained untouched. No notices. No inspections. No pressure. The contrast was impossible to ignore. It confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Enforcement was not evenly applied. And that meant the system was not functioning purely on rules, it was functioning on selection. This realization marked a turning point. Instead of trying to meet an undefined standard, the narrator shifted his focus toward understanding how that standard was being applied. He began documenting not only his own experiences, but also what he could observe publicly in the neighborhood. He kept records of notice dates, inspection timings, and the specific issues that were raised. He compared those details with visible conditions elsewhere. He tracked patterns, even when they seemed insignificant. Over time, those patterns became clearer. There were cycles. Periods where attention intensified, followed by periods of relative calm. These cycles did not align with changes in his property. They appeared to follow an internal rhythm, something connected to the HOA's own processes. This led him to a deeper level of investigation. He began reviewing publicly available HOA records. Meeting summaries, enforcement logs, financial reports, documents that most residents ignored became essential sources of information. At first, the content seemed routine. Administrative updates, budget discussions, maintenance plans. But when viewed alongside his own records, inconsistencies began to emerge. Enforcement activity did not always align with documented priorities. Certain issues were addressed quickly, while others, sometimes more significant, remained unmentioned. Financial allocations for improvements were recorded, but not always visible in the neighborhood itself. These were not obvious errors. They were subtle misalignments. But together, they suggested something important. The system was not as unified as it appeared. The narrator began to understand that the HOA operated on two levels. The formal level, documents, rules, and official processes, and the informal level, observation, influence, and interpretation. The woman across the street existed within that second level. Her role was not defined by title alone, but by presence. She observed consistently, reported selectively, and influenced outcomes without needing direct authority. The system processed her input, translating it into formal action. This made her influence both effective and difficult to challenge. Because on paper, everything remained legitimate. Notices followed guidelines. Inspections were justified. Corrections were documented. But the pattern behind them told a different story. The narrator also began to notice the emotional environment of the neighborhood more clearly. Residents maintained distance when it came to HOA-related topics. Conversations shifted quickly. Eye contact broke sooner than expected. There was awareness. But there was also caution. People were not unaware of what was happening, they were choosing not to engage with it. That choice created a kind of collective silence, one that allowed the system to continue without resistance. Silence, in this context, was not neutrality. It was protection. The narrator realized that many residents likely preferred to avoid becoming targets themselves. By staying quiet, by not questioning the system, they reduced the risk of drawing attention. This behavior reinforced the system's structure. Because a system that is not questioned does not need to justify itself. The narrator's own position within this environment became more defined. He was no longer just a resident receiving notices. He had become a focal point within a larger pattern of selective enforcement. But instead of reacting, he continued to observe. His documentation became more structured. He created timelines that aligned notices with visible conditions in the neighborhood. He compared enforcement frequency across different properties. He noted how quickly issues were identified after changes were made. The results were consistent. His property experienced a level of attention that could not be explained by rules alone. At the same time, his compliance behavior did not reduce that attention. If anything, it seemed to sustain it. Each correction was followed by another notice, as if the act of compliance kept his property within the system's focus. This revealed something critical. The system was not designed to resolve issues quickly. It was designed to maintain oversight. And oversight required continuity. The narrator began to see his situation not as a series of problems, but as a case study. A way to understand how influence operated within a structured environment. The more he analyzed, the clearer the system became. It was not random. It was patterned. And patterns, once identified, can be tracked. By the end of this phase, the narrator had shifted completely from reaction to analysis. The emotional strain was still present, but it was now accompanied by clarity. He understood what was happening, even if he had not yet decided how to respond. He knew that the system relied on ambiguity. And he was beginning to remove that ambiguity. Quietly, carefully, patiently. Because once a system is understood, it becomes predictable. And once it becomes predictable, it can be challenged, not through confrontation, but through exposure. The HOA Karen believed she had control. But what she didn't realize was that control built on selective enforcement is fragile. Because it depends on one thing above all else: remaining unseen. Understanding the system changed how the narrator saw everything, but it also changed how he felt everything. What had once been a straightforward frustration slowly evolved into something more complex. It wasn't just about notices anymore. It was about living in an environment where every action felt observed, every decision subtly judged before it even settled into place. That kind of pressure doesn't announce itself loudly. It builds quietly. It reshapes routines. It alters habits. It turns ordinary moments into calculated ones. The narrator began to notice how deeply this had affected him. He moved differently in his own space. Tasks that once felt natural, adjusting the yard, stepping outside, making improvements, now carried a layer of hesitation. Not because he didn't know what he was doing, but because he knew someone might be watching. That awareness created distance between him and his own home. And that distance was the most unexpected part. Because a home is supposed to feel like control. Instead, it had started to feel like performance. But as this realization settled in, something else began to emerge, something quieter, but just as important. Connection. Not the obvious kind. Not conversations or direct acknowledgement. But small, almost invisible moments that carried meaning. It started with a glance. One afternoon, while he was making a minor adjustment near the edge of his yard, he noticed a neighbor across the street pause briefly. There was no expression of concern, no gesture of involvement, just a moment of stillness that felt intentional. A recognition. Not of the action itself, but of the situation. That moment passed quickly, but it stayed with him. Because it suggested something he hadn't fully considered before. He wasn't the only one noticing. Over the following days, he became more aware of similar moments. A neighbor lingering slightly longer while walking past. Another adjusting something in their own yard with a level of precision that felt unusually deliberate. Subtle changes in behavior that mirrored his own. It wasn't coordinated. But it wasn't random either. It was shared experience. The neighborhood, which had once felt silent in a way that suggested indifference, now felt quiet in a different way, like people were aware, but cautious. That distinction mattered. Because awareness, even when unspoken, creates connection. The narrator began observing not just patterns of enforcement, but patterns of behavior. He noticed how certain homes experienced brief periods of increased attention, followed by stretches of calm. How residents made small adjustments before issues were even raised. It became clear that others had felt some version of what he was experiencing. Maybe not as consistently. Maybe not as intensely. But enough to recognize it. This realization changed the emotional landscape completely. What had once felt isolating now felt shared. And shared experience reduces pressure in a way that no rule ever could. The narrator didn't approach his neighbors. He didn't try to start conversations about the HOA or its behavior. That kind of direct engagement would have disrupted the fragile balance that existed. Instead, he allowed the connection to remain subtle. Because subtlety was what made it possible. He noticed that when he made adjustments, others seemed to observe with quiet understanding rather than judgment. When new notices appeared on his door, there was no visible reaction, but there was also no sense of distance. The neighborhood wasn't ignoring him. It was acknowledging him carefully. That careful acknowledgement created a bridge. A bridge built not on words, but on recognition. At the same time, his perception of the HOA Karen began to shift. She was no longer just a source of pressure. She became part of a pattern, someone who operated within the system in a way that amplified its imbalances, but was also shaped by those same structures. Her behavior followed a rhythm. Observation. Reporting. Absence. Then repetition. She didn't act constantly. She acted selectively. And that selectivity aligned too closely with enforcement cycles to be coincidence. But now, the narrator saw something else. Her influence depended on the system responding to her. Without that response, her observations would remain just that, observations. This realization introduced a new layer of understanding. Control wasn't just about who watched. It was about who acted on what was seen. And that meant the system itself was just as important as the individual influencing it. The narrator's focus expanded again. He wasn't just observing her anymore. He was observing how the system reacted to her. How quickly notices followed her presence. How often her observations aligned with enforcement. How consistent that alignment remained over time. The more he studied it, the clearer the relationship became. Her influence wasn't absolute. It was conditional. And conditions can change. Meanwhile, the emotional atmosphere of the neighborhood continued to evolve. The quiet connections between residents grew slightly stronger, not enough to become open communication, but enough to reduce the sense of isolation that had once defined the experience. People stayed outside a little longer. Movements felt slightly less restricted. Meanwhile, the emotional atmosphere of the neighborhood continued to evolve. The quiet connections between residents grew slightly stronger, not enough to become open communication, but enough to reduce the sense of isolation that had once defined the experience. People stayed outside a little longer. Movements felt slightly less restricted. There was still caution, but it was no longer rooted in uncertainty. It was informed. The narrator felt this shift within himself as well. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. It was no longer reactive. It was focused. Directed. He was no longer adjusting his behavior out of fear of being noticed. He was adjusting it with awareness of how the system functioned. That difference was subtle, but powerful. Because awareness creates control, not over the system itself, but over how one exists within it. At the same time, his documentation process became more refined. He began organizing not just facts, but relationships between those facts. Aligning timelines, comparing patterns, identifying points where behavior and enforcement intersected. He wasn't building an argument. He was building clarity. And clarity, once established, has a way of spreading. Without direct communication, the neighborhood itself began reflecting that clarity. Residents who had once seemed disconnected now moved with a quiet sense of understanding. The patterns that had once been invisible were becoming easier to recognize. And recognition changes everything. Because once people see a pattern, they stop accepting it as random. They start questioning it. Even if that questioning remains internal. By the end of this phase, the emotional landscape had shifted completely. The narrator was no longer alone in his experience. The neighborhood was no longer silent in ignorance. And the system was no longer operating entirely unseen. The bridges had been built. Not through confrontation. Not through words. But through shared awareness. And that awareness was about to lead to something the HOA Karen hadn't anticipated. Because once a system is no longer invisible, it becomes accountable. And accountability, even when quiet, creates pressure. The kind of pressure that doesn't stay contained. The kind that builds. And eventually, forces change. The situation reached a breaking point when the narrator stopped reacting and started presenting evidence. Instead of quietly fixing each notice, he organized everything: dates, patterns, repeated inspections, and submitted a formal request questioning the inconsistency. The HOA didn't respond immediately. That delay said everything. At the same time, enforcement suddenly increased across a few homes, making the pattern more visible. Neighbors began noticing similarities. What once felt personal now looked systemic. The narrator stayed calm and consistent, sending follow-ups that focused only on facts. No emotion. No accusations. That pressure forced the HOA to slow down. Some notices were withdrawn. Others were revised. Communication became cautious. The system wasn't collapsing, but it was reacting. And for the first time, it was no longer in complete control. That as the HOA reviewed itself, the truth became clear. Enforcement had never been fully neutral. Certain individuals, especially the HOA Karen, had gained informal influence over time. Her observations were being prioritized, turning personal attention into official action. It wasn't written anywhere, but the pattern proved it. Once exposed, the system had no choice but to adjust. Decisions became slower, more structured, and less dependent on one person. The narrator's property was no longer targeted the same way. Inspections became normal instead of excessive. The real revelation wasn't just about her, it was about how easily systems can drift when no one questions them. In the end, everything changed quietly. The notices stopped. Enforcement became fair. The neighborhood relaxed. The HOA Karen was still there, but her control was gone. She could no longer influence the system the way she once did. The narrator didn't win by fighting. He won by understanding. The biggest lesson was simple. Power in systems like this doesn't come from rules, it comes from how those rules are used. And once people start seeing the pattern, that power disappears. Because what's exposed can't control you anymore.